Hello there, I am Mr. Wizardly. Today I will be doing a reply video, truly the pastime of all legitimate intellectuals. Now I will be responding to a very nice chap called the DM LAIR. I've occasionally been dipping in some of his content lately, and it's mostly been pretty good. Please notice me, senpai. But this video is the first one that I've found that is giving, in my opinion, some rather questionable advice. My intention by making this video is simply to provide him with a different perspective that maybe he hasn't had a chance to consider yet, and hopefully I'll be able to make my case to him and cast my daylight spell, ending the darkness effect of equal or lower level that exists in his mind. So that's enough of me waffling on. Let's now see what he has to say for himself.
Ha ha! We're victorious!
Alright, now let's tie the survivors up so that we can turn them over to the magistrates.
Hey, that's a waste of time! They're all guilty! I slit their throats!
What do you mean? That's not very nice!
Yeah, aren't you supposed to be neutral good or something?
Yeah, so? We've been playing this game for 2 years, and not once has anyone ever mentioned anyone else's alignment. What difference does it make?
Okay, so this is a legitimate point that he's highlighting here, but I feel that he draws some very different conclusions from it than I do. Now, it's very true, your average player in your run-of-the-mill D&D group will often create their character, fill out an alignment that sort of makes sense for the premise that they're going for, and then they'll just forget about it. And they won't think about their alignment for ages and ages, happily playing out the game, until finally someone at the table just so happens to bring the matter up again. He seems to be suggesting here that just because the players forgot about it for a while, what is even the point of including alignment in the game at all? Whereas, I would suggest that this moment proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that important character development has taken place with the hooded guy, which up until now hasn't been addressed by the rest of the party. His decision to simply murder their prisoners marks a noticeable shift in his behavior as far as the other characters are concerned. So their players are using the alignment mechanic as a way of trying to express their confusion with his character's actions. Think about it for a moment. Some of the characters in the party have intentionally kept these bad guys alive for whatever reason. Perhaps they used non-lethal damage to knock them out, which is something the player has to actively declare, and if they did this, well, they must have done it because of a particular in-character reason. For instance, maybe their character is an upstanding citizen who does genuinely think that it should be left up to the magistrates to dispense justice, because they are a righteous and accountable public institution, whereas a vigilante adventuring party is not. Or maybe they don't like killing. Or maybe they didn't kill them because they might need to go back and interrogate them for information later. After all, the more prisoners you have, the more likely it is that one of them will be able to tell you what you need to know. Alternatively, perhaps some of the baddies realized that with their leader defeated, there was no real point in fighting on, and so they laid down their weapons and surrendered to the party in good faith, in the hopes of getting a more lenient punishment, rather than just receiving an immediate and violent death at the hands of the heroes. And if that happened, then the heroes have very likely accepted their enemy's surrender, because the characters admit that they have taken them prisoner in the skit. But now the hooded guy has gone rogue, get it? And started killing them without first consulting with the rest of the group. That is a worthy point of discussion, both in and out of game, and it is absolutely worth it to reassess the hooded guy's alignment, because he has changed. He needs to rethink where he aligns now, and then make that simple change on his character sheet. It's a recognition of how far he's come. So, where is the problem, you might ask? Well, that will become clear as we continue.
Because your alignment is supposed to determine how you behave.
Okay, fine!
Yes, it is this attitude that is the problem. Rather than role-playing out the in-character decision that the hooded guy has made to take justice into his own hands, some of the other players at the table, whether they know it or not, are now attempting to use alignment as a blunt instrument to bludgeon the hooded guy into submission and shame him until he takes back his legitimate in-game action, trying to make him conform to their expectations because they didn't like what he was doing. This is a long-standing problem, and it is the main reason that people don't like alignment, because other people are trying to tell them how their character should behave. But this is a completely backwards way of looking at it. You are not role-playing an alignment, you are role-playing a character. Alignment is mostly just an easy way of showing your fellow gamers which of the heroic or villainous archetypes your character falls into, and that archetype gives them a basic idea of what to expect from your character when you roleplay with them. How do you know what alignment your character is? By observing how they tend to behave most of the time. So to put it into simpler terms, it is your character's personality that determines their behavior, and it is their behavior which can then be used to determine their alignment. Your character should be the starting point, not your alignment. Of course, bear in mind that sometimes your character will veer off from this default position due to the circumstances that they find themselves in. Maybe a good aligned character panics in a stressful situation and ends up killing someone innocent because they overreact. Or maybe a lawful aligned character has to go against their principles if they want to save someone that they love. That one exception by itself doesn't necessarily make them change alignment. What matters is their overall pattern of behavior.
Welcome to the DM Lair. I'm Luke Hart, and I've been a Dungeon Master since high school.
Master Luke, sir, it's so good to see you fully functional again.
I submit to you that alignment is sort of like the vestigial organ of Dungeons & Dragons, and that we are perhaps better off without it.
I can see why you would think that, because the lead designers of D&D 5th edition do kind of think of it that way too. They wanted to replace alignment with personality traits, ideals, bonds, and flaws, but they didn't have the guts to rip alignment out of the game altogether because they understand that yes, it is an important part of D&D for some people, even if they personally don't understand why. The main thing that they correctly identified, and I thank them for doing this, was removing all of the mechanical punishments for either being a certain alignment or for changing your alignment. That was unnecessary baggage from a more authoritarian age, as Mr. DM Lair rightly mentions later in this video. The last thing that we need to do right now is get DMs beating their players with a stick for not role-playing correctly. Here's the quote from later on where he covers this point.
And I suppose alignment could also be used to enforce game mechanics. This was much more prevalent in previous editions, but it sure seems like 5th edition has mostly gotten away from that. It almost seems like the designers of 5th edition really wanted to get rid of alignment, but they were afraid the public outroar would be too much for them. So alignment is still officially in the game, but as far as mechanics go, it has almost no influence.
I don't blame people for not understanding how to use alignment well, because no one has properly explained it in a Dungeons & Dragons book since 3.5 edition, and even in 3.5 it wasn't perfect because it still had needless mechanical restrictions attached. Their line of reasoning was that when your character changes their alignment, they are obviously in the middle of an identity crisis. They aren't sure of their new direction in life, and therefore, to represent that mechanically in the game, you only get half the experience points of everyone else, because you're so tormented and uncertain about your future. But, you could just, roleplay that out and not only get half XP, and then it's just sort of fine? I mean, is it just me who thinks that? Anyone? No? Okay.
Now before you throw your keyboard across the room or punch a hole in the screen of your phone while leaving a heated comment, hear me out.
I want to educate you so bad right now.
And I get that probably right now some of you are Googling my name to see if you can find out where I live, so you can track me down and teach me a thing or two about alignment.
So I totally did that, but I can't be bothered to fly to North America, so that leaves me with just one option. I'll have to become an armchair warrior on the internet instead. Fear me. Don't fear me. Let's just move on to the next important part of the video.
Benefits of alignment. The alignment system helps define the D&D universe. Good and evil explains concepts like angels and devils and why they behave the way they do. Alignment can even be used to set up the premise of your campaign, good versus evil. I think a lot of campaigns run it like that. And games can be run around the concept of law versus chaos or good versus evil.
Yes, I agree. There's a lot of interesting philosophical substance to play around with there, and it is very useful when it comes to creating your setting's gods and cosmology, themes for your campaign, and giving you an easy, fleshed out framework for devising interesting NPCs to populate your game world. good points.
For instance, there might be an emperor who strives to conquer the world, crushing anyone who stands in his way. But his real goal is to put law and order in place so that he can remove poverty and suffering from the world. The cities currently under that emperor's rule benefit from peace and prosperity, and the populace there is actually quite happy. However, those that oppose him are treated brutally until they submit to his will. Now, is that emperor good or evil, or lawful or chaotic? You see, the fine line between good and evil could be a focus of your game. It could be a moral dilemma that your players have to confront.
Okay, yes, this is a great moral dilemma for your players and their characters. Do they support the Emperor and excuse his brutal methods of bringing about this supposed utopia? Or do they oppose him? Spoiler alert though, the example that you give isn't really all that ambiguous. He is absolutely 100% lawful evil. Let me explain. The doctrine of evil is that the ends justify the means. What those ends might be will vary from evil character to evil character, but they all agree on one thing, that they are willing to do terrible things if it gets them the results that they are looking for. Sometimes they are a villain, which is someone who holds purely selfish motivations and is willing to victimize others for their own benefit, because they don't particularly care how they achieve their goals, only that they do achieve them. At other times, the evil character is an anti-villain, which is a term that some of you might not know, and it means someone who holds selfless motivations but feels that they have to do despicable things for some supposed higher good. Again, the ends justifies the means. As a brief tangent that may be of interest to you, an anti-villain is essentially the opposite of an anti-hero, much like how the hero is the opposite of a villain. Here is a handy chart that conveniently explains these character concepts and how they relate to each other. Pause the video and have a little squint if you're interested. I should probably do a video on this sometime. It's a whole topic of its own that we don't really have time for here. There have actually been a lot of examples of anti-villains in popular media lately, which most prominently includes Marvel's big purple evil guy, Thanos. Those of you who've seen the movie Infinity War know what I'm talking about. So going back to the video, Mr. DM's Lair doesn't really give us any concrete examples of chaotic behavior from this hypothetical emperor of his. In fact, the emperor is very consistent about his motivation, his principles, and his methods, and seeks to rule through a tyrannical level of control over society. Even though that society may be somewhat peaceful and prosperous, that is irrelevant to the emperor's alignment, because it is achieved through overtly evil actions and oppression. As a rule of thumb, if you use the term brutal as the primary descriptor of a guy, you know that he's either evil, or at least he often gets pretty darn close. He is directly opposed to freedom and the idea of subjectivity, and shows no particular inclination to break the rules that he has laid out for others to follow. This is not so much a case where you will be questioning what alignment the Emperor represents, because that's not where the point of drama is. Rather, your players should be figuring out whether or not they agree with him. Do they think that his end goal of building a utopia justifies his tyrannical means of getting there? Evil ideas can be seductive, that's the whole point. It asks you a question. What price are you willing to pay? Will they eventually join him on his crusade to unite the world? Will they actively oppose him because they value self-determination and freedom? Or will they try to keep their noses out of it so that they don't make any powerful enemies? The party is free to decide, and their decision will likely have meaningful consequences for the world around them. That about covers it. On to his next point.
Alignment can also be used for your players to help determine how they roleplay their characters. A paladin can decide to be lawful good.
You mean lawful stupid?
He can decide to be honorable and compassionate and all of the other things that go into being lawful good. Those are things that can absolutely guide a player's roleplaying of their character. I have had some players take their alignment very seriously, and as a result, they've roleplayed some amazing characters.
I tend to agree with this because yes, alignments are a selection of ready-made character archetypes that can be used as a framework to quickly build a new character from. Or they can be used as inspiration to help add to an existing idea you might have had. asking you the questions that you need to pin down your character's ideas about morality and figure out how principled they are. But remember this bit and keep it in mind because it's going to come up again later. Okay then, so skipping ahead again.
Drawbacks of alignment. The number one drawback of alignment is that it can cause lots of disagreements. Come on, admit it. Almost every time alignment gets brought up at the game table, it's part of an argument.
But it doesn't have to be that way, brah. This is not a problem with alignment. This is a problem with authoritarian DMs and players who are seeking to control the actions of someone else at the table. That is the problem that needs to be addressed here. Don't attack your fellow players for role-playing their character. Whenever possible, try to play out their actions as well as the consequences of those actions in-game. The DM can then take them aside later if necessary. Have the debate after the game, not during the game. During the game, the players have to agree. All character actions are real and must be taken seriously. No takebacks, and definitely no complaining unless it's done in character. Otherwise, you're just destroying the suspension of disbelief at the table. As long as all of the players abide by this, then there should be few, if any, problems. If you as the DM think that there's something more going on, and that they're being a problem player, then again, you can just call for a break, take that player aside and have a polite talk with them, explaining to them what you believe the problem is to try and create a dialogue about it. What does the problem player think of your concerns? Is there something that they can explain to you about their perspective that could help ease your worries? Successful gaming groups are built upon a foundation of trust, and forming that trust can be a slow process, but you won't get there if you're just getting mad and arguing and being petty and not talking to each other. That'll just create a simmering resentment that will eventually boil over and lead to the destruction of your group. You need to be grown-ups, airing your differences and trying to understand one another, and hopefully you will come to some sort of compromise in the end. Sometimes another character will do something crazy and wildly unexpected, and the number one reason as to why we might feel uncomfortable about what they're doing is because we don't know if we can trust the player of that character not to take things too far. There are times when a character's behavior in-game can become blurred with the attitude of the player that controls them. Always, 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 you need to talk and figure things out.
I smashed the innkeeper's head in! Whoa! Isn't that a little bit extreme?
Yeah, what the crap? Now, usually I condone behavior like that, but you're like neutral good. You wouldn't actually do that.
I hate to say it, but the rogue has a point. Aw, come on, that's bullcrap. I should be able to do what I want. Even the kitty cat agrees. Dungeon Master?
Yes, the barbarian guy does have the right to do almost whatever he wants, so long as he is being considerate towards his fellow players and he abides by whatever social contract the group has agreed to. Once everyone knows what everyone else's tolerances are for controversial topics, in most cases these include how people feel about including graphic violence, horror, romance, sex, sexual violence, and other specific instances of immorality in their game. As long as people play within those bounds, then they should have the freedom to do more or less whatever they want. If the other players or the DM voice their concern about the barbarian guy's behavior, again, this is mostly down to a lack of trust. Rather than telling him that what he's doing is wrong, which is an assumption, they should ask his player if he can explain to the group what his character's motivations are for caving in the innkeeper's head. Is it a logical exception to his normal behavior? Or is it a character-defining moment where he's changing and possibly heading down a darker path, something that does warrant a reassessment of his alignment and the attention of his fellow party members? Perhaps Barbarian Guy's player will ask for the others to make an in-game insight check to determine what they can figure out about this unexpected behavior. Or maybe he would just be upfront about what the other characters would make of it, as one would assume that they probably know him well enough by now.
Come on, let's be honest. How many game sessions have devolved into arguments over alignment and whether a PC would do something that a player wants him to do? And do those arguments actually contribute to everybody's fun at the game table? I submit that they probably don't.
Again, the behavior is the problem, not the alignment. I'm sounding like a broken record at this point. So as a quick-fire recap, it can either be about having an informative civil conversation where the player explains their character's rationale to the group and will then review their alignment if necessary, or this can be about some fools who are trying to control people, and that's gotta stop.
If I ever catch you acting like a crazy fool again, you're gonna meet my friend Pain!
Next, a character's stated alignment at character creation is rarely the way that character actually gets played.
Then just update the alignment. Problem solved. It's just a tool that is used to help flesh out and articulate your character concept. If the character moves away from that over the course of play, then that is called character development, and it is a good thing. Updating the alignment is then recognition of how far they've come. Let's look at Han Solo as an example of characters that change over a short period of time. During his first appearance in Star Wars Episode 4, Han is clearly chaotic neutral. He's in it for himself and the money, something that he says many times, and even shoots first against the bounty hunter that came to kill him, although George later tried to edit that and pretend it didn't happen. But Luke and Leia's enthusiasm and conviction ends up rubbing off on him, and he becomes a hero who swoops in at the last minute to save the day. But he didn't stick to his original alignment that was laid out for him at character creation. Obviously, alignment is bad.
I have found that players fill out their alignment and then mostly seem to forget about it. And then at some point during the game, the Dungeon Master or somebody else notices that that player is actually playing a different alignment than what his character sheet says. It's almost like, what's the point?
I would suggest that you're being overly generous with your anecdotal evidence in this segment. I'm sure that the North American plebs who play at your table aren't using alignment properly, but my very sophisticated and refined European group tends to be very consistent with their starting alignments. It's a case of he said, she said. Hashtag not all gaming tables do this, and when they do, it's usually down to either character development or an early change in concept. That's fine.
And here's a novel idea. What if we don't fill in alignment until we're in a few game sessions, and a player actually decides how he is going to roleplay his character?
There's nothing inherently wrong with your idea. I mean, I've allowed my players to do this when they're not really sure about what they want to play and would prefer to feel it out as they go along. But you could also just update your character sheet when you notice it's changed. It's not really that big a deal, you know?
And my final point is that alignments usually get ignored during the game unless it's being used against the player. So in other words, we mostly ignore alignment unless we're going to weaponize it. Yeah, that sounds like something we probably don't need.
And my European group does not do this. Checkmate! Mwahaha! I've already covered this extensively.
How I use alignment in my games.
I'm gonna be neutral good. I wanna smash stuff, but only for the greater good. Yeah, I'm more like neutral myself.
You mean true neutral?
Yeah, that. I just don't want to pick a side, you know?
Well, I'm lawful neutral. It is the most logical alignment after all.
Yeah, whatever. You all suck. I'm chaotic evil. Time for some stabby.
That's fine, guys. You can pick any alignment you want, as long as you're not doing evil things in the game.
But I'm evil. Chaotic evil.
Yep, I get it. Your character sheet can say anything that you want it to say. Just don't do anything evil.
Well, that's not logical. What kind of dungeon master?
Whoa, stop right there. Do you remember that one video where you questioned the DM and got force choked to death? Ha ha ha, that's right. And we're all out of Revivify scrolls too.
And that's basically it. The players can choose whatever alignment they want. I tell them that their character sheet can say any alignment whatsoever, as long as they don't actually do anything evil, because I'm not running an evil campaign. But of course, if I were to run an evil campaign, then things would obviously be a little bit different.
Okay, so you're not wrong. I mostly agree with you, but I do have some small caveats that I'd like to attach to this. On the one hand, it is perfectly valid for the Dungeon Master to pitch their campaign as something specific that the players need to buy into. And that is what Mr. DM LAIR is talking about, right? I'm going to be running a campaign about a holy order of knights who are trying to rid the realm of evil. So, Please create your characters with this theme in mind. Or, I'm going to be running a brutal and gritty low magic setting for Dungeons and Dragons, like that episode of Game of Thrones I watched that one time. The night is dark and edgy and filled with, boobies. So, create characters that would fit into this oppressive feudal society. And that's fine. That's perfectly fine. But I don't like some of the potential implications of what you said if you were to take it at face value.
And I have learned from experience that when you have most of your players role-playing good PCs, and there's that one player who wants to role-play a bad PC, who's like backstabbing the good players, or stealing from them, or things like that, people tend to get legitimately upset at the game table. And because it can cause lots of issues at the game table, I usually try to avoid all of that. Unless, of course, the premise of the game is that you are all evil.
You seem to assume that evil characters are inherently disruptive to the party. That's a big assumption. And don't get me wrong, it's the first thing that a lot of people think of when you use the big fat E word. Heh, I'm going to play a chaotic evil character, so that I can dick over my friends for no reason. It's gonna be great to see the look on their faces. But the thing is, Dungeons and Dragons is a cooperative game. It always has been. So if your sole purpose is to constantly do petty backbiting and undermine the group, that's not really being considerate towards your fellow players. Well, unless they explicitly signed up for that type of game. Fun fact, even murder hoboing is a valid and enjoyable way to play the game. You just have to all be on board with it for it to work out and make sure that everyone is having fun. When evil is done wrong, though, I agree, it can potentially be very disruptive and can infringe upon the enjoyment of other people. Just don't be that kind of evil character. Fortunately, there are many ways to play someone who is evil. Of course, if you play an openly evil character in a group with openly good PCs in it, and there's nothing compelling them to work together, that's a recipe for disaster. However, if an evil character, or conversely a good character, is more under the table with their alignment and has reason to work with the rest of the group, well, that is much less of a concern. An evil character is smart enough to know that they can take advantage of some useful idiots to get what they want. And even though they are very selfish, a villain-like character also often has one or more people who they do genuinely care about. If you can make the person that your evil character cares about into another party member or an important NPC, you can have a strong role-playing hook that sets you up to work with the rest of the group, where you can either be partners in crime, a reformed criminal and his hapless friend who is always trying to keep him on the straight and narrow, a father who has had a hard life and is ruthlessly overprotective of his child. I mean, my god, there are so many options that are interesting to roleplay, but you won't allow any of them because I can only be evil in name only. It doesn't matter if it's clever or interesting. You're not allowed to do anything evil, which defeats the whole point of playing an interesting evil character in the first place. Now let's use a charitable interpretation here and say that you meant, I don't allow people to be openly evil, especially if they're using it as a petty excuse to screw over their fellow players. A very reasonable sentiment. But I hope that you now realize that because of the way you're phrasing this, people could misinterpret your advice and come to the conclusion that they mustn't ever trust their players with being evil unless everyone is evil, because that's what Mr. DM's Lair does and he's a smart guy. When in fact, it's a lot more nuanced than that, and I'm fairly sure you would agree with me on that point. It's all about whether or not the player can pull it off well, and whether or not they can be trusted to be sensitive towards their fellow players, taking the enjoyment of others at the table into account. For the record, I don't really like running for evil characters in the style of a constantly hurting innocent people simulator. That just doesn't inspire me. If I did run an evil-centric game, I would have the evil characters fighting mostly against other evil people, where there can be more intrigue and scheming and shady alliances and backstabbing. That's just my preference. So I can also understand it if you were to share a similar point of view and just don't like the idea of DMing a proper campaign with any evil characters in it, saving that sort of stuff for clowny one-shots or beer and pretzels style games. You're perfectly within your rights to place that kind of restriction on your game if you want to. No one is forcing you to run the game for people, so of course, your preferences would need to be taken into account as well. But having that lone evil character, or maybe a couple in a group with good or neutral characters, especially if my players sell me on their concept, and there is a reason for them to work within that party dynamic, well, I would absolutely trust my players to pull that off, and I'd let them try it, because I'd make sure that they understood the parameters involved first. And I don't even mind if the evil characters end up betraying the other members of the party at some point, so long as they do so in a suitably dramatic and meaningful way. I mean, we need something more worthwhile than player A randomly stealing player B's magical spoon collection and running off with it. That's not much of an epic betrayal. And it must also serve a purpose in furthering the story, rather than derailing everything, which is what will happen if it's not properly planned out. The DM needs to have been in on this plot since day one, and needs to have been given adequate warning so that they can collaborate with the evil players and prepare for it ahead of time, turning the moment of betrayal into a loosely scripted event that has the power of the DM backing it up so that it all goes smoothly once their knives are drawn. If you think about it, it's not all that different from any other backstory hook. The idea is that you create your character, you include some interesting narrative elements from their past that the DM can later weave into the story, giving the adventure a more personal touch. That's just standard practice at many tables now. A pending betrayal is just that, another narrative element that the party will eventually have to confront and overcome. When the great betrayal happens, this will most often signal the end of a chapter for the group, whereby the evil characters leave, one way or another, and those players roll up some new characters, who will then join the remnants of the party's surviving heroes, ready to start afresh with an altered roster, but continuing on with the same campaign, perhaps looking to rebuild, or maybe seeking revenge against their turncoat former comrades, who are now treated as NPCs if they survived. Or maybe you treat it as significant enough to be a grand finale, what your campaign has been building up to, a final battle where loyalties are tested and you let the dice fall where they may. To the victor goes the spoils, before moving on to greener pastures in an all-new campaign once the dust has settled. Bear in mind that a betrayal doesn't necessarily have to involve a showdown where the heroes battle it out to the death. It could instead be as simple as frustrating the hero's plans at a crucial point, getting them captured by the big bad, or being dramatically revealed to be a spy because of clues that have been strategically seeded amidst enemy correspondence by the DM for the rest of the party to uncover. Maybe the betrayers do have some small fondness for the other characters in the group, and so they go out of their way not to kill them, sparing their lives if they are defeated. With evil characters, it's all a matter of finding a good fit. One of my characters that I had a couple of years ago was, okay, get this, an interdimensional magical alien centaur zebra girl whose daddy was a big bad evil dude and a conqueror of worlds. She wasn't evil herself, she was actually true neutral in alignment, although she sometimes walked the line just short of being neutral evil. She aspired to be a good ruler who was loved by her people, but she also understood that sometimes she would have to make tough and unpopular decisions, and needed to appear strong in order to be respected. I was hoping that she might have some character development regarding how she saw her dad, and would eventually come to recognize some of the problems with him. She would then complete her arc by inheriting the throne in the other world after defeating her rival siblings, and would become a better ruler than her dad had been, because she would have learned some valuable lessons from her time with the party, given that I had conveniently contrived to strand her there with them, so she didn't have much of a choice in the matter. They were the strongest folks around after all, so she stuck around with them in the hopes that they might prove useful to her. However, the problem was that everyone else in that group was convinced that she was actually evil, and treated her with the utmost suspicion at all times. At one point, they were even reluctant to fight against the most evil kingdom in the world, on the grounds that she seemed keen on the idea, therefore it must be a bad thing. At that point, I recognized that she just wasn't a good fit for the group, and so I set up a possible exit point for her with the DM, which would take place immediately after we finished overthrowing that evil kingdom I just mentioned. She didn't even get that far though, because she ended up getting one-shot by a prismatic spray in a boss fight. Haha, 3.5 can be so epic sometimes. But she would have left the party either way once that was completed, so I guess it's all good. Okay, so to justify that particularly long tangent, the lesson is, if the character fits, they can stay. If they don't fit, then the DM needs to have discussions with that player to try and find a way for them to better integrate into that group, or alternatively, encourage that player to roll up a new character and try something different, hopefully in a way that retires the problem character with a cool send-off, or perhaps sets them up to become a dangerous and embittered NPC adversary that can surprise the party in the future. Something juicy like that tends to take the edge off of their loss.
I have been running my games for years without paying much attention at all to alignment, and so far there really doesn't seem to be a whole lot of negative consequences to it. So in my experience, basically removing alignment from the game hasn't really affected it much at all. And in my experience, when alignment does come up, it's usually used in a negative way. It's used as a hand slap to a player who isn't role-playing his character properly. But who is the ultimate authority on how to role-play that character if it isn't the player? In situations like this, alignment is almost always used to take away player agency.
You can't do that. You're lawful good.
I have only ever seen alignment contribute positively to a game a handful of times. But even then, it was a rather negligible contribution, and in all honesty, those same things could have been done without the alignment system as we know it. In fact, I believe that many of the benefits I mentioned at the beginning of the video for using alignment could be realized without using the alignment system at all. And thus, my final conclusion is, let's just get rid of alignment already.
Okay, so I think at this point we can quite clearly see some contradictions and double standards creeping in. For starters, I'm pretty sure you said near the beginning that when some of your players committed to role-playing out their alignment, it had a really positive impact on their characters.
I have had some players take their alignment very seriously, and as a result, they've role-played some amazing characters.
And now, suddenly, you've changed your story from that to the contribution of alignment to those characters was just kinda meh and didn't really matter. It could have easily been done without alignment. So, I'm confused. Was alignment important to those characters or not? Not to sound conspiratorial, but did you just say that to mollify the pro-alignment crowd at the start? To lure them deeper into your video? I mean, I don't know. Maybe you just changed your mind and did an oopsie. It happens sometimes. Second, you said multiple times that you shouldn't use alignment because it devolves into people telling each other how to roleplay, and we should be free to roleplay however we want. But at the same time, you say that you, Mr. DM's Lair, are arbitrarily restricting your players from roleplaying however they want, by explicitly banning them from doing any quote-unquote evil actions. Isn't what you're doing exactly the same thing as you're accusing alignment of doing? Only you're imposing your restrictions upon it from the get-go, rather than disputing it halfway through a game. I mean, you could also enforce alignment from the get-go too, and then what's really the difference? They're both an arbitrary restriction to people's roleplay. It's just not a very coherent or principled argument, in my opinion. I only encourage my players to limit their behavior based off of the group's social contract, how disruptive they are being, and most importantly, the impact they are having on other people's fun, which is the overall guiding principle here. And I know them well enough by now that I trust them not to go that far, or at the very least that I can talk to them about it and get them back on track if they do start to become a problem player. So, in conclusion, alignment is not the bedrock of D&D. Sure, you can definitively say that it is only an optional rule. Taking it out of the game is like removing your car's radio. The car is still perfectly serviceable, it'll get you to where you need to go, but the radio is a tool that can be used to enhance your enjoyment of the driving experience. Or, alternatively, I suppose you could misuse the radio by listening to some of that dreadful popular music of the current year that the kids listen to these days. I mean, it all depends on how you use it. Throughout his video, Mr. DM's Lair ends up focusing on players that are either misusing or actively abusing the alignment rules, but doesn't show many positive examples beyond one or two that he then sneakily goes back on at the end. He promised to give alignment a fair shake, but uncharacteristically for him, I don't think that he did. Even if he ultimately doesn't agree with me, I think he would agree that he should have done just a little bit more to properly play devil's advocate here, given that he knows alignment is something of a complicated and controversial topic. I personally think that where we can, it's important to foster a culture where we listen to both sides of the argument, so that we know where the other side is coming from and can adequately address their criticisms. You won't be able to change someone else's mind unless you can successfully address all of their concerns, and you can't do that until you understand what those concerns are. One final point before I go. I personally find, and this is entirely anecdotal of course, that there are a lot of D&D players out there, especially ones who have played multiple editions of the game, that have essentially constructed in their head a vague, blurry amalgamation of various outdated alignment rules. And that is where a lot of the authoritarian style hang-ups that Mr. DM's Lair has so kindly illustrated originally come from. And let's face it, if those players read the 5th edition Player's Handbook entry on the topic, while they might come to understand that we no longer punish people for not adhering 100% to their alignment, they otherwise wouldn't be that much clearer about it, because the developers didn't understand it very well either. It's a collective ignorance that many people in our hobby share, which is a great shame. I just hope that we can correct these misconceptions in time, and eventually unlock the true potential of alignment as a constructive tool that players can hopefully draw inspiration from to quickly flesh out their character concepts, and see what traditional D&D archetypes their characters embody. Want more information on how to use alignment properly? Well, ladies and gentlemen, as a matter of fact, I've been working on just such a video, which may or may not be out at the time that you watch this. Shameless plug, shameless plug. So, you can subscribe for that, and more videos from me if you want to. The link to the DM LAIR'S video is below in the description if you want to watch it uninterrupted and in full, along with my Patreon and Subscribestar if you feel like supporting my work. That's about all for now. Mr. Wizardly, signing off.